Before Skrilla became famous, his studio was never empty at night.
911, what's your emergency?
The interview room was uncomfortably warm, radiators hissing in the corner despite the mild autumn weather outside. The reporter had been waiting for 20 minutes, reviewing her notes and checking her recording equipment one last time. She'd conducted hundreds of interviews throughout her career, politicians deflecting questions, witnesses recounting tragedies, soldiers sharing their battlefield experiences. But something about this particular meeting felt different. When the door finally opened, she understood why. The man who entered looked older than his file suggested. According to the redacted military documents she'd been provided, he was only 28 years old, but the person shuffling into the room could have passed for 50. His eyes were hollowed, ringed with dark circles that spoke of countless sleepless nights. His hands trembled visibly as he lowered himself into the chair across from her, and despite the room's warmth, he wore a heavy jacket that he kept wrapped tightly around his frame. The newspaper had agreed not to reveal his name, a condition he'd insisted upon before agreeing to this interview. His commanding officers had been equally adamant that his identity remain protected, though they'd been far less willing to discuss why. When pressed, one officer had simply said, "What happened to him? It's better if fewer people know the details." "Thank you for meeting with me," the reporter began, her voice gentle. She'd learned long ago that trauma survivors needed time and patience. "I know this isn't easy." The soldier, let's call him Dmitri, though that wasn't his real name, nodded slowly. His eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the reporter's shoulder, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to make direct eye contact. "Before we begin," he said, his voice hoarse and scratchy, "I need you to understand something. I've been on the front lines for 14 months. I've seen buildings collapse on civilians. I've watched friends die in ways I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I've lived with the constant thunder of artillery, the screams of the wounded, the smell of death that never quite leaves your nostrils." He paused, swallowing hard. "But none of it, haunts me the way that night does. The night we went into the village near Donetsk." The reporter leaned forward slightly, her recorder capturing every word. "Tell me about that night. Start from the beginning." Dmitri's hands clenched and unclenched on the table between them, a nervous gesture he seemed unaware of making. It was late October. The fighting had been particularly brutal that week, both sides pushing hard, neither gaining much ground. Our unit had been tasked with sweeping through what remained of a small village about 15 kilometers outside Donetsk. Command needed to know if there were any enemy positions, any civilians hiding in the ruins, anything that could be tactically relevant. He spoke mechanically at first, as if reciting from a report he'd written dozens of times in his head. The village had been shelled weeks earlier, maybe by our side, maybe by theirs, maybe both. It didn't matter anymore. By the time we arrived, there wasn't much left. Most of the houses were burned out husks. Others had been hastily abandoned, doors left hanging open, personal belongings scattered in yards where people had fled in panic. The reporter made notes, letting him find his rhythm. "What struck me first was the silence," Dmitri continued, and now his voice took on a different quality, something deeper, more visceral. "In war, you get used to certain sounds. Artillery in the distance. Small arms fire. Helicopters overhead. Even when it's quiet, there's always something, wind rattling through broken windows, rats scurrying through debris, birds that are too stupid to leave a war zone." He shook his head slowly. "But this village, it was silent in a way I'd never experienced before. Not peaceful, that's the wrong word. It was oppressive. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you want to speak just to break it. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through those streets." "How many of you were there?" the reporter asked. "3 of us for the initial patrol. Myself, a corporal named Yuri who'd been with the unit for 6 months, and a younger soldier, barely 20 years old, named Alexei. He'd only been with us for 3 weeks. Still had that nervous energy of someone who hadn't seen real combat yet. Dimitri's jaw tightened at the mention of Alexei's name. We started our sweep around 3:40 a.m. Command wanted us to move under cover of darkness, minimize the risk of sniper fire or ambush. We each carried standard kit, assault rifles, night vision, radios, the usual. The plan was simple: work our way through the village systematically, clear each structure, report back by dawn. He paused to accept a glass of water the reporter offered him. His hands shook so badly that some of the liquid sloshed over the rim. We'd cleared maybe a dozen buildings when Yuri noticed the smoke. Not the stale, cold smell of old fires, this was fresh. Recent. Like someone had just extinguished a campfire within the last hour. The reporter's pen moved steadily across her notepad. Could it have been civilians hiding in the village? That's what we thought at first. It wouldn't have been unusual. Displaced people sometimes return to ruined villages to salvage what they can, or because they have nowhere else to go. But something about it felt wrong. Wrong how? Dimitri was quiet for a long moment, searching for words. Have you ever walked into a room and just known, somewhere deep in your gut, that you shouldn't be there? That you've stepped into a space where you're not welcome, where something fundamental is out of place? The reporter nodded slowly. That's what it felt like. The smell of smoke wasn't just fresh. It was deliberate. Like someone had lit a fire specifically to draw our attention. And underneath it, there was another smell. Something organic and wrong. Like spoiled meat mixed with burning chemicals. Dimitri's breathing had become slightly labored as he spoke, as if the memory itself was physically taxing him. We followed the scent through the village streets. Yuri took point, I was in the middle, and Alexei covered our rear. Standard formation. We were being careful, moving slowly, checking corners and sight lines. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. That's when we saw the tracks. What kind of tracks? That's the thing, I don't know. None of us knew. They weren't boot prints, that's for certain. We'd been tracking enemy movements for months. I could tell you the difference between Ukrainian military boots and Russian ones in my sleep. These weren't animal tracks either. I grew up in the countryside, spent my childhood hunting in the forests. I know what dogs, wolves, deer look like in mud and dirt. His hands began to tremble more noticeably. These marks were elongated. Almost finger-like, but too long and too thin. Each one was maybe 15 centimeters in length, pressed deep into the dirt like whatever made them was heavy. But here's what made them truly disturbing: they didn't follow the pattern of walking or running. They were spaced irregularly, and they seemed to drift across the ground rather than strike it with purpose. Could you sketch them? The reporter asked, sliding a piece of paper toward him. Dimitri picked up the pen with obvious reluctance. His hand shook as he drew a series of elongated, curved impressions on the paper, shapes that looked vaguely like fingers but stretched unnaturally, with odd angles and proportions that made the eye uncomfortable. Like this, he said quietly. And there were dozens of them, all leading in the same direction. Toward the old school at the edge of the village. The reporter studied the drawing, feeling an inexplicable chill despite the room's warmth. What did you do? We should have called it in. Should have requested backup or at least reported what we were seeing. But Yuri was concerned that if we radioed command about strange tracks, they'd think we were losing our minds. Stress does strange things to soldiers, hallucinations, paranoia, breaking under pressure. He didn't want that on his record. Dimitri's voice took on a bitter edge. So we decided to investigate first, report later. God, I wish we'd made a different choice. He drank more water, his throat working convulsively. The school was one of the few structures in the village that hadn't been completely destroyed. Windows were shattered, and part of the roof had collapsed, but the main building was still standing. The front doors were hanging half open, swaying slightly despite the absence of any wind. As we approached, we heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was a whispering. Not words, not any language I recognized, but definitely vocal. Multiple voices, maybe, all overlapping and speaking in unison. The sound seemed to come from inside the building but also from the ground beneath our feet, like the earth itself was murmuring. The reporter found herself unconsciously leaning back in her chair. Alexei wanted to turn back, Dmitri continued. I could see it in his eyes, pure, animal fear. He was young, but his instincts were good. Yuri and I, we'd been at this too long. We'd become numb to fear in a lot of ways. You have to survive at the front. So we ignored the warning signs our bodies were screaming at us. We entered the school. The words hung in the air between them. The interior was darker than it should have been. Our night vision goggles were on, but they seemed less effective than usual, like the darkness inside was denser, more resistant to penetration. We switched on our weapon-mounted flashlights, and that's when we saw the walls. What was on them? Symbols. Scratched into the plaster and concrete with something sharp. They covered every available surface, the walls, the ceiling, even parts of the floor. Circles within circles, intersecting lines forming geometric patterns I couldn't comprehend, shapes that seemed to writhe and shift when I tried to focus on them. Dmitri's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They looked too deliberate to be random graffiti, too chaotic to be anything organized or human. Some of the markings appeared fresh, with powder still dusting the floor beneath them. Others seemed older, darker, as if they'd been burned into the surfaces rather than carved. We moved through the hallway, our boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The whispering sound grew louder, and now I could tell it was definitely coming from deeper inside the building. One of the classrooms at the end of the corridor. He stopped, his eyes unfocused and distant. There was a light coming from under the door. Dim and flickering, like candlelight, but with a greenish tint I'd never seen before. Not quite phosphorescent, but close. It pulsed irregularly, sometimes brightening suddenly, other times fading almost to darkness. Yuri signaled for us to approach. We stacked up beside the door in breach formation, Yuri on point, me in the middle, Alexei covering. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and leave, but training and pride pushed me forward. Yuri kicked the door open. Dmitri's hands clenched into fists on the table. There was a figure standing in the center of the classroom. A man, or what had once been a man. He wore a military uniform, but it was scorched and tattered, hanging off his frame in strips. I couldn't tell which military it belonged to, all the insignia had been burned away or torn off. His face. Dmitri's voice broke slightly. His face was wrong. Not just injured or disfigured, fundamentally wrong. The proportions were off, like someone had tried to arrange human features from memory but gotten the spacing incorrect. His skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and I could see dark shapes moving beneath it, like shadows trapped under ice. He was standing perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides, head tilted at an angle that should have been anatomically impossible. And he was staring directly at us, though I couldn't see his eyes, they were lost in shadow, or perhaps they simply weren't there at all. The reporter realized she'd stopped taking notes, completely absorbed in the account. What happened next? Yuri tried to challenge him. Identify yourself. Standard protocol. But before he could finish the sentence, the figure moved. Not walked, moved. One instant he was in the center of the room, the next he was 3 feet closer, but I never saw him cross the space between. Like frames had been cut from a film. Alexei collapsed. Just dropped to his knees like someone had cut his strings. His rifle clattered to the floor, and he started making this sound, not screaming, not crying, but a kind of continuous whimper that made my chest hurt to hear. I tried to raise my weapon, but my arms wouldn't respond. It was like my body had decided on its own that resistance was pointless. Yuri managed to lift his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't aim. Dimitri's face had gone pale, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead despite the room's temperature. The figure opened its mouth. The jaw unhinged, and I mean literally unhinged, dropping far lower than any human jaw should be capable of. The inside of its mouth was dark, but not empty dark. It was a darkness that seemed to pull light into it, like a void. And then it spoke. His voice had dropped to barely audible. Or screamed. Or whispered. I don't know how to describe it because it was all of those things at once. Multiple voices layered over each other, some near enough to feel breath on my face, others so distant they seemed to come from another world entirely. The words, if they were words, made my head throb. I felt warmth trickling from my nose and realized I was bleeding. The lights flickered. Once, twice, then faster, creating a strobe effect that made the figure appear to be in multiple places simultaneously. And through all of it, that sound, that impossible layered voice, continued, rising in pitch and volume until I thought my eardrums would burst. Then everything went dark. Dimitri reached up to wipe sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. When the lights came back on, and I don't know if it was our flashlights or something else, the figure was gone. Simply not there anymore. The room was empty except for me and Yuri. He paused, his breathing ragged. And Alexei. Alexei was gone too. The reporter's pen had frozen mid-word. Gone. What do you mean? I mean he vanished. Disappeared. One moment he was on his knees beside us, the next moment there was just empty floor where he'd been. No sound of running footsteps, no dragging, no struggle. He was just, erased. Yuri and I searched the entire school. We called Alexei's name until our voices were raw. We checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing. It was as if he'd never existed. Dimitri's eyes had a haunted quality now. We radioed for backup, reported a missing soldier and possible enemy contact. A full squad arrived within 20 minutes. They searched the school, the surrounding buildings, the entire village perimeter. They found the same symbols on the walls that we'd seen. They found the strange tracks in the dirt around the building. But they never found Alexei. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. Here's what makes it worse, what makes it impossible to dismiss as hallucination or stress-induced delusion. That same night, a Russian patrol on the opposite side of the village reported seeing an unusual silhouette near the school around 4 a.m. They described it as humanoid but wrong, moving in ways that defied normal locomotion. Their report, which we only learned about later through intelligence channels, mentioned the same details. The unnatural silence. The strange tracks. The symbols. One of their soldiers went missing that night too. Just vanished during their sweep of the area. The reporter felt a chill run down her spine. Both sides filed reports. Both sides had witnesses. But when higher command reviewed the accounts, they sealed them. Classified. The official story became that both missing soldiers had deserted or been captured, their fates unknown. But you don't believe that? No, Dimitri said flatly. I don't. Because I saw what I saw. And I know what I felt in that classroom, the wrongness of it, the sense that we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist in our reality. He looked directly at the reporter for the first time. War is hell. I've made peace with that. I've seen humanity at its worst, the things we do to each other when survival and ideology collide. But that thing in the school, that wasn't human evil. That was something else. Something older and more fundamentally wrong. The reporter set down her pen. What happened after that night? Yuri was transferred to a different unit 2 weeks later. I heard through the grapevine that he'd requested the transfer, couldn't stay with us after what happened. Last I heard, he'd been discharged on psychological grounds. Having nightmares so severe he'd attack fellow soldiers in his sleep, thinking they were it. And you? I finished my tour. Got through it by drinking too much and sleeping too little. When I finally rotated out, I thought maybe I could leave it behind. Return to civilian life, get a normal job, pretend none of it happened. He laughed bitterly. But it doesn't work that way. Every night, I dream about that classroom. Every time it's dark and quiet, I hear that whispering. I can't look at shadows without wondering if they're natural or if something's moving in them. The military doctors say it's PTSD. They prescribe medication and recommend therapy. And maybe they're right. Maybe my mind broke under the stress of combat, and everything I saw was just a manifestation of that trauma. He met the reporter's eyes again. But if that's true, how do you explain the Russian patrol seeing the same thing? How do you explain both sides independently reporting identical details? How do you explain the physical evidence? The tracks, the symbols, the two missing soldiers. The reporter had no answer. I agreed to this interview, Dmitri continued, because I need people to know. Not for validation or to prove I'm not crazy. But because whatever we encountered in that village, I don't think it's gone. I think it's still there, or others like it are out there, and eventually someone else is going to walk into the wrong building at the wrong time. Do you have any idea what it was? The reporter asked. What you saw? Dmitri was quiet for a long time. I've done research. Spent months reading folklore, mythology, accounts of supernatural encounters throughout history. Some cultures have legends about entities that feed on conflict, that are drawn to places where the boundary between life and death grows thin. War zones, massacre sites, battlefields. The Slavic tradition talks about things called NAV, spirits of the restless dead that exist in a realm between worlds. There are similar concepts in almost every culture that's experienced prolonged warfare. He shrugged. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe the violence and death in that region had torn some kind of hole, allowed something through that shouldn't be here. Or maybe it was always there, and we just stumbled into its territory. Or maybe, he added quietly, it was exactly what it appeared to be, a soldier who died but didn't stop. Who kept fighting some war that transcends our understanding of reality. The interview wound down after that. The reporter had pages of notes, hours of recorded testimony, and more questions than answers. As Dmitri prepared to leave, pulling his jacket tighter despite the room's warmth, she had one final question. Do you think Alexei is still alive somewhere? Dmitri paused at the door, his back to her. I hope not, he said softly. Because whatever that thing was going to do with him. I think being dead would be merciful by comparison. The reporter's investigation didn't end with that interview. Over the following weeks, she managed to track down two other soldiers who'd been in the area around the same time, one Ukrainian, one Russian. Both had been discharged, both had refused to speak on record, but both confirmed the existence of the classified reports. More disturbingly, she discovered that another patrol had gone missing near the same village just one day after Dmitri's encounter. An entire four-man unit had entered the area at dawn and simply never returned. Search parties found their equipment scattered around the old school, but no bodies, no blood, no indication of what had happened to them. The symbols on the walls had multiplied. Photographs taken by military investigators showed that the markings now covered every surface of the school's interior, spreading like an infection. And then, without explanation, the military cordoned off the entire village. Officially, it was due to unexploded ordnance making the area too dangerous for patrols. Unofficially, soldiers stationed nearby reported seeing strange lights in the village at night, hearing sounds that made hardened veterans refuse guard duty in that sector. The reporter submitted her article to her editor, complete with copies of the redacted reports she'd obtained and transcripts of her interviews. The editor read everything, then quietly filed it away. This isn't going to print, he told her. Not now, maybe not ever. Too sensitive, too bizarre, and frankly too dangerous. Both sides would deny it, discredit you, and that would be the end of your career. The reporter protested, but she understood. Some stories are too strange, too frightening, to be told in the normal channels of journalism. So the files sit in a locked drawer, waiting for a time when the world might be ready to hear about what happened in that ruined village near Donetsk. Waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to investigate further. Because whatever exists in that school, whatever took Alexei and those other soldiers, whatever scratched those symbols into every available surface, it's still there. Waiting in the darkness. Whispering. If you think this was just a soldier's ghost story, think again. Another patrol vanished in the same village only one day later, an entire 4-man unit that entered at dawn and never came back. Their equipment was found scattered around the old school, but their bodies never recovered. The symbols on the walls had multiplied. Military investigators found them covering every surface, spreading like an infection through the building's interior. And then both sides sealed the area. Officially, unexploded ordnance. Unofficially, something in that village makes hardened combat veterans refuse guard duty in the sector. The classified reports still exist. The witnesses are still out there, carrying memories that medication and therapy can't touch. And the thing in that school, whatever it was, whatever it is, remains. War changes people. But whatever was encountered in that ruined village near Donetsk wasn't a person. And it wasn't fighting for any side of any war we understand. If you want more real wartime horrors and unexplained encounters that official reports tried to bury, hit subscribe, because the next story goes even darker. And the evidence? It's harder to dismiss.